So we left off in our last video talking about the idea of brinkmanship. All right. So the fear here is that if the Cold War got hot between the United States and the USSR directly, there could be nuclear war that would ensue. And so, at all costs, pretty much both sides wanted to prevent that. But the fear was still there and was pretty consistent all the way through. I mean, schools used to do like nuclear attack drills, things like that in places where they were afraid of this might happen. So, I wanted to point out the idea here of the domino theory in conjunction with the containment policy and with the Iron Curtain mentality. The domino theory was kind of the idea that if one country would fall to communism, they would all fall. And this is really kind of the idea behind the containment policy. And so, again, if we go back up here and we look at this, we're trying to contain communism where it is. We don't want it to expand any further. That was what the West, that was the United States and the West were trying to do. And so, in particular on these places right here, this is where you really run the strongest risk of the expansion of communism because, well, you've got China and the Soviet Union kind of in that area, and both of these countries are vying for influence over those third world, quote, third world countries. And so that's what brings us to the Korean War. So it's important to know that even though we are looking at a war, we're calling it the Korean War, right? It is not really going to count as a hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It is what we're going to call a proxy war. Okay? And this is kind of what we mean by this is it's a war that is like pretty much you could look at it like this. You could say that the Soviets and the United States were players, but they used the Korean people, or they used the I guess, vying political ideologies in this place as their chess pieces. And so the United States would support the Democratic Koreans, and the Soviets and Chinese would support the Communists. All right, so I hope that makes sense. An example of a modern day proxy war would be the Syrian civil war, where you've got again two conflicting sides that really aren't just Syria and the rebels. It's the Russians who back the Syrian government, and the United States and all the other allies here that have ties to the rebels. And so proxy wars still go on today, and they still kind of mean the same thing. And so that's what you have here with Korea. So after World War II, just like with Germany, and just like Germany was being partitioned between the Soviets who control the East and the Allies who control the West. Well, the Japanese surrendered to the Soviets in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, and in the southern part they surrendered to the United States. And so Korea had already been occupied between the Soviets who controlled the north and the West, the United States who controlled the south. And so with that said, by late 1940s, the both Soviets and the United States had kind of begun to leave. They had begun to withdraw their troops. But what the Soviets had done was they went ahead and supplied tanks and weapons to the northern Koreans so that they would be able to take the whole peninsula. And see, they had adopted communist ideology. But Truman refused to allow this to happen. He refused to be appeased. And going back to the terminology we used referring to Neville Chamberlain. And so what he did was he sent MacArthur, who led a coalition forces against the Soviets in this regard. And the UN forces led by MacArthur had driven North Koreans back to their northern part of the Korea, and even further than that. But the Chinese felt threatened by the fact that there was a UN presence that close to their territory, and so they actually sent reinforcements into the north as well, to help reinforce the northern Korean effort. And so you really do have this true proxy war going on here. When it's all said and done, the war accomplished absolutely nothing. In fact, the line was still pretty much drawn at the same place as it was when it started. And but it did absolutely and firmly establish North and South Korea as one nation with two political systems. All right. So in other words, this is an example of a multi-state nation. Okay, multi-state nation, because from a national identity standpoint, there is really no difference between a Northern Korean and a Southern Korean. They are culturally and ethnically and nationally Korean. The difference resides in the kind of state that they're run by. Okay, so there's one thing I definitely want you guys to recognize, especially if you're ever going to take a geography class at a later date. Another proxy war that you may have heard of, or may even know someone who is a veteran of this war, was the Vietnam War. And just like with Korea, it was a containment effort. So the United States had ultimately gone in to try to contain the expansion of communism. Now, this containment effort begins prior to the United States involvement. In fact, Vietnam was part of Indochina. It was the it was a possession. It was a colonial possession owned and operated by the French. And so they wanted to keep it after World War II. But what happened was the Japanese had invaded it, had taken it, and Ho Chi Minh, which was a young national, revolutionary, he was also the communist leader of the Viet Minh League, or the independence movement for Vietnam. The thing is, when the Japanese had come in and invaded, Ho Chi Minh was there fighting against them. And then when they left, he kind of, and all the people in Vietnam kind of thought that, hey, we were going to be an independent country at this point. They were not expecting the French to want to come back. So Vietnam was a colony of France. Ho Chi Minh led a resistance against France, and then later on also against the Japanese, and then the French wanted to reestablish a colony, and so we have us a problem here. And so Ho ends up with his revolutionary forces. They would actually use guerrilla tactics and hit and run tactics and things like that to really make the French have a hard time here, and eventually they defeat the French. And completely have them surrender, and they give up. But the United States uses their policy of containment as like a scapegoat, I guess as a justification, rather, is a better word, for going in and trying to prevent the fall of Vietnam to communist leaders. And Ho Chi Minh was a communist leader, all right? And so, once again, we look at the fears of the domino theory. If one country falls, they're all going to fall right behind. And so this kind of justified the United States involvement. And so the United States and France got together. They set up an anti-communist government in the south of France. Okay, you can see that right here. So all this right here would have been the government, the democratic, the anti-communist government that was established by France and the United States. And this right here is those that were under control of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. All right, and so the Viet Cong, these are going to be those who resist the established government that was put in place by France and the United States. Viet Cong resisted that government, which was led by, I'm going to butcher this, Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay, this guy was the leader that the United States and French had put in place of the anti-communist government in the South. But he was pretty much a dictator, and the people couldn't stand him. He wasn't popular among anyone. And the Viet Cong also, they're going to be communists. Okay, they were communists in the South who wanted to fight against the government that the United States and the French had put in place. So you're already kind of probably seeing a trend here that I'm kind of, pointing at as a central idea, is that the people there didn't like what the United States and the French were doing. They didn't like the government that was established there in the first place. So they assassinated Diem. It looked like they were going to take over South Vietnam. In fact, the people that came after Diem were just as unpopular and unliked as the rest. And then the United States gets involved militarily by sending in 185,000 troops. And so they were facing two problems here. Okay. Now, even though the United States is a superior army in the world, like just cutting edge, top notch, best technology, best equipment, best of the best, right? The two problems is one, they just weren't able to fight guerrilla warfare effectively in foreign territory. In particular, this kind of foreign territory with jungles and just nasty environment. This is just a terrible place for guerrilla warfare if you're not familiar with that terrain. And number two, no one at all really supported the government in the South. Nobody supported. There was no support. So the soldiers were fighting a war that no one cared about. And so that's going to be a problem that's going to take its toll. At home, the war ends up becoming wildly unpopular. It became more and more unpopular among the peasants of Vietnam because, for example, some of the things that the United States would do is in the event that like it looked like they were trying to, say, disrupt supplies for the Viet Cong, they would end up bombing farms and stuff that were owned by the peasant civilians. And so every single thing they did seemed to kind of blow up and produce even more countermeasure against what they were doing in the first place. And so the United States, I guess President Nixon ends up getting just huge amounts of criticism over the war and finally starts to bring them home in 1969. The last Americans were out of the war. I mean, I guess we're out of the country by 1973, and within 2 years after that, the South Vietnam government falls. When it's all said and done, you have about 58,000 Americans killed, and way more people from Vietnam killed. Millions of Vietnamese were killed in this struggle. Okay, and I'm not going to take the time really in this video to look at this chart in great detail. It is in the book. I do recommend you pause and just take a quick look. It talks about a lot of the things that we just mentioned, like brinkmanship and propaganda and all these different things, the multinational or supranational alliances. But I do want to take the time in the next video to look at just a few more of these proxy war conflicts that have still huge ramifications in the world we live in today. I'm sure you're going to be familiar with every single one of them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.